Welcome everyone to today's story, an intense tale like any other. In this video, we'll dive deep into the mind of Olivia. In the world of corporate law, where ambition and desire often collide, Olivia Taylor had always kept her personal and professional lives in strict alignment. But when Douglas Chappelle, a charismatic executive, entered her office and her life, Olivia found herself caught between the stability of her carefully planned marriage and the dangerous allure of temptation. What would you do if faced with such a revelation? Stick with me as we unravel this gripping story. Attorney Olivia Taylor was one of the first people to meet Douglas Chappelle. She was introduced by the head of GE Schenectady's administrative offices. At first sight of the tall, very handsome executive, Olivia had a personal attraction that took all her professional poise to suppress. She would have to work with him, after all, and she was not the kind of woman who gushed over a man or openly flirted. Douglas Chappelle was the new chief of the real estate tax division of GE Schenectady. Oliva was a senior associate attorney in the corporate counsel's office. The Real Property Group was a separate but associated office at GE Schenectady. Doug wasn't Oliva's boss, and he wasn't exactly above her in the corporate strata. However, he was a rising star and one clearly destined for great advancement. He was also amazingly handsome and possessed that unique set of personal attributes defined as charisma. His arrival sent a shockwave through the female staff of GE Schenectady, from the women in the production plants to those in the executive suites. The legal division was mostly female-staffed at both the clerical and professional levels. It was particularly affected. At first, Olivia paid the whispering and speculations among her female co-workers. Only scant attention. It wasn't that she was unaffected, but she simply refused to let herself go down that kind of path. As the rumors of Doug's bedroom skills and his extraordinary endowment grew, she became more interested, notwithstanding her resolve. She watched her female associates, and even her own secretary, Julie Stevenson, shamelessly flirt with Doug Chappelle. But Olivia resisted such silly female behavior after all. She was an attorney and a married one at that. She had advanced enough in her career to have acquired a pretty side-hall colonial house in Delmar, not far from the elementary school. This was a prelude to starting a family, which was something she and her husband David were discussing. In her typical fashion, Olivia had put a good bit aside for the eventuality of children. She was a planner and meticulous in preparation for each of the defined stages of her life. To some, her marriage to David at the end of college and before law school might have seemed precipitous, but in fact, it was part of a carefully considered strategy. David began teaching middle school science while she went to law school. David put off his career ambition of becoming a marine biologist. He had envisioned himself living on a boat in a more southern climate. That was the kind of romantic dream David was prone to, and a substantial part of what endeared him to his more practical wife. As their married life turned out, David enjoyed teaching, and in the last 2 years he returned to graduate school nights and summers. However, with their 2 incomes, the couple were now well prepared for becoming parents. David's dream would stay just that, a dream that was beached on the bank of the upper Hudson River. Their dog, Buster, came along as the only unexpected wave in Olivia's ordered existence. Buster was a rescue. Olivia's husband, David, took his class to the animal shelter on a school trip. At the shelter, David discovered a forlorn little pup, seemingly too ugly of form to be an easy adoption. But ever the romantic, David fell under the spell of 2 big brown eyes. David overlooked the awkward and ugly countenance of the Irish Wolfhound and St. Bernard mix and brought the newly christened Buster home to meet Olivia. She at first sight had had her doubts about this addition to their diminutive household, but it seemed a small compensation for the loss of a big dream. The puppy grew into a monstrously large, ugly dog that scared visitors, but only for a moment. Buster was an affectionate giant whose only threat was that he might lick you to death. Olivia had found herself loving the great beast almost as much as she loved her husband. They were 2 big, lovable creatures who looked odd and fierce, but were loving and beautiful within. Olivia had a house, a dog, and a happy, contented marriage with the promise of children to come. Or at least she did until Doug Chappell began his move on her. She was exactly his type, a pretty girl maturing into a more beautiful woman. She hadn't yet lost the shyness and trepidation of her youth, and still had that visage of innocence so appealing in a young bride. But most of all, she was holding herself away from him. To a man who enjoyed easy success with women, the ones he had to work for were always more desirable. Entering Olivia's office one afternoon, Doug said, "We need to do something about these triple net leases in the town of Colony." He moved around Olivia's desk until he was standing all but touching her. He had one arm over the back of her desk chair and the other pointing to the spreadsheet he had laid out on her desktop. General Electric Real Property Division had a substantial history of success fighting real property taxes. However, the town of Colony was a formidable opponent. The town had significant commercial expansion dating back to the 1960s and had developed a vigorous defense of its assessments. "What do you propose?" Olivia queried Doug. She had turned in her chair as she said this, and it put her virtually between his arms. She was close enough to feel the heat of his body, and she felt his almost magnetic pull. "I thought since under the leases we have the rights of the owners assigned to us that we file in a riem proceeding on the property assessments." "All of them?" Olivia asked. He looked her straight in the eyes as he responded. "Yes, all of them. I never like leaving anything unfinished." She could feel that he was talking about more than the leases, and it set off an excitement within her that was exhilarating and frightening at the same time. "That's a big undertaking. You will find there is a strong defense. I find that a robust defense can always overcome the defense." Oliva began working on the tax cases with Doug. He hired independent appraisers and did the initial tax protests, and Oliva began to prepare the in rem petitions. In rem was Latin for in the thing, which in these cases was the real property. There is no action against a defendant, only a request that the court review the assessment. The town stood by its assessments, which were nearly all the standard 150% of value instead of the actual value the law required. Still, Oliva was required to do a lot of work preparing these cases for trial. Doug kept the work under his personal supervision, and that required him to have a lot of contact with Olivia. He wasn't kidding about putting forward a significant offense both in the tax cases and against Olivia's resistance to his advances. She fought hard, even though she wanted nothing more than to capitulate at his first advance. She was a normal woman with all the desires a woman can have, but adding to her problem was her own inexperience. Olivia had known no man's except her husband. He was her first, as she was his. In her plans, they would remain faithful to each other until death did them apart, but she couldn't help wondering what another man would be like. She had no doubt that Doug was extraordinary in bed. There were several women in her own office who had allegedly warmed his sheets, including Olivia's secretary Julie, who had a 2-month affair with Doug. Julie actually bragged about her experiences with Doug and ended the liaison only when her husband became suspicious. Julie's husband was not the type to tolerate or understand. Olivia wasn't Julie. And although Olivia's husband David was not the jealous type, his trust and unconditional love made it more difficult for Olivia to betray him. She was no cheater. Olivia would not go behind her husband's back, but Doug was hard to resist, and deep inside she knew she didn't want to resist. It was not like David was a slouch in the bedroom, but he was ordinary, above average height, below average looks, and averagely endowed where it counted. If you judged men by their character, David was a prince. He was certainly Olivia's prince, and she had known that from their first meeting, sitting next to each other in freshman biology. They just clicked on so many levels. She did love David, but there was something about Doug that made him irresistible. True to his word, Doug put on a determined offense. He flirted shamelessly. He complimented her hair, shoes, her dress, and any little bit of jewelry or flash that she wore. If she were being honest with herself, Oliva would have recognized that almost from Doug's first appearance at the GE offices, she had been dressing differently. She stopped wearing pants to work. Her pinstriped lawyer's suit jackets topped matching skirts that got tighter and shorter with the change of each season. Everything about Oliva began to change, from the way she wore her hair and her scent. to the lacy tops of the stockings that replaced her pantyhose on the outside. Olivia, the tight-laced lawyer, resisted, but the sensual woman within was pushing to get out. Doug Chappell knew how to cut a woman's laces. He suggested a working lunch, but off campus where they could work without being disturbed. A drink after work came soon after the lunch. "Just one," he said. "You've earned it." A drink would lead to a late return home. At first, David was waiting with Buster, but as summer passed into fall, David was often gone, working on his boat, he said. The first summer teaching, he had acquired a little sunfish and learned to sail on Lake George. Eventually, David went to work summers at the Albany Yacht Club, earning little more than minimum wage. Oliva figured it kept some portion of his dreams alive. It added to the funds they were setting aside to start a family, a kind of baby fund. Oliva couldn't object that David was gone when she was so often late, but Buster was always there to greet her with a quizzical look. Or was it an accusatory look? If Buster knew her inner conflict and how dangerously she was walking toward the edge, he couldn't say. If David suspected, he was pretending not to notice. You are probably wondering how the story continues, but that's all we have for today. Comment down below if you want the next part. What do you think Olivia will do? What do you think, David? I'd love to know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.